Viitorul e al tău, noi punem temelia. UTCP, construim pentru România. UTCP, Universitatea de Construcții București.
Hello everybody, welcome to this special moment. In your schedule it was written that there is a special lecture, but actually everything will be much more special because, as you see, we have a ceremony for delivering the title of Doctor Honoris Causa. This is a ceremony organized by the Senate of the University. My name is Alexandru Aldea. I am the president of the Senate, and I am joined in this procedure by executive of our university, Professor Radu Văcăreanu, the rector of the university, Professor Laurențiu Rece, vice rector of the university, Professor Mădălina Stoian, vice rector of the university. And traditionally, our ceremony will start with a little bit of music. We will listen to Gaudeamus Igitur, an occasion to stand up, to honor academia. Thank you very much. We have one more step before reaching the peak moment, and this step is the presentation of Laudatio. It will be done by Professor Dimache, the Dean of Faculty of Hydrotechnics.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will read the laudation in Romanian. Stimate domnule rector, stimați membri ai Senatului, dragi colegi, suntem astăzi, așa cum spunea domnul președinte, într-un moment deosebit, acela de acordare al titlului de doctor honoris causa domnului doctor Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy. În calitate de decan al Facultății de Hidrotehnică din cadrul Universității Tehnice de Construcții București, îmi revine deosebită plăcere de a-l prezenta pe domnul profesor dr. Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy cu ocazia decernării titlului de doctor honoris causa la universității noastre. Domnul profesor Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy este o personalitate marcantă din domeniul APEI, reputația sa profesională fiind construită în peste 30 de ani de activitate intensă, recunoscută la nivel mondial. A absolvit secția de inginerie civilă la King's College, University of London, a obținut titlul de master în inginerie în sănătate publică și ulterior titlul de doctor în mediu și resurse de apă la Imperial College of London. Domnul profesor Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy și-a început cariera didactică în anul 1993 la Universitatea South Bank din Londra, unde a activat până în anul 2002. Spiritul întreprinzător al domniei sale s-a manifestat încă de la debutul. Îmi cer scuze, vorbesc prea repede. De formație profesională. Spiritul întreprinzător al domnului Vairavamoorthy s-a manifestat încă de la debutul în activitatea didactică de la Universitatea South Bank, unde înființează și conduce Departamentul de Cercetare pentru Dezvoltarea Apei, din cadrul Facultății de Mediu Urban, un departament de cercetare de succes din această universitate. Între anii 2002 și 2005 a activat ca profesor asociat la Departamentul de Inginerie Civilă al Universității Loughborough, unde a îmbinat activitatea didactică cu intensă activitate de cercetare. Din 2005 și până în septembrie 2010 activează ca profesor în cadrul UNESCO IHE, Institutul pentru Educație APEI, Technical University of Delft, Olanda, unde de asemenea are o ferventă activitate de cercetare. La Delft este numit șeful colectivului de sisteme durabile de apă urbană și membru al Consiliului Academic al UNESCO IHE, unde inițiază și urmărește strategia privind cercetarea, planul de implementare și monitorizarea progresului proiectelor. În toată această perioadă a fost implicat în activitatea de cercetare și a condus o serie de proiecte, din care poate cel mai important a fost proiectul SWITCH, Sustainable Urban Water Management, al cărui director științific a fost. Proiectul SWITCH a fost derulat în perioada 2006-2011, fiind unul foarte complex, un proiect integrat al Uniunii Europene pentru managementul durabil al apei. În paralel cu activitatea desfășurată la Delft, între 2007 și 2010 este profesor și șef al Catedrei de Inginerie a Apei al Universității din Birmingham, Marea Britanie. A dezvoltat mai multe parteneriate cu organizații naționale și internaționale și a fost responsabil pentru mai multe proiecte de cercetare în domeniul apelor urbane. Din poziția sa de copreședinte al programelor IVA, Cities of the Future, al programului Urban Water al UNESCO IHP și de director al SWITCH, domnul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy pune bazele cercetării în domeniul apei, recunoscute la nivel internațional prin Universitatea din Birmingham. Între anii 2010 și 2015 deține poziția de decan, fondator al Colegiului de Sustenabilitate Globală, PATEL, din cadrul Universității din Florida de Sud, Statele Unite. Domnul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy conduce activitățile de cercetare, educație și biroul de sustenabilitate din campus. În calitatea sa de decan fondator, dezvoltă un program internațional inovator de master în sustenabilitate globală, program ce primește recunoașterea mondială, fiind menționat de revista Nature. De asemenea, a fost președintele inițiativei Universității Partenere a UN Habitat, în care s-au înscris 140 de universități din întreaga lume. Prin această inițiativă s-a realizat schimbul de cunoștințe între universități, iar domnia sa s-a implicat în discuții cu diversi delegați de la sediul ONU cu privire la modul în care universitățile ar putea contribui la dezvoltarea societății pe baze sustenabile. În perioada 2015-2017 este director general adjunct al Institutului Internațional de Management al Apelor, unde conduce activitatea de cercetare axată pe provocările globale de dezvoltare pentru securitatea apei și gestionarea resurselor naturale. Domnul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy lucrează îndeaproape cu organisme financiare și instituții de cel mai înalt nivel: Banca Mondială, Banca Europeană pentru Investiții, Parteneriatul Global pentru Apă, Institutul de Cercetare pentru Planificare și Proiectare Urbană din Shanghai și Banca Africană de Dezvoltare, ONU Habitat, UNESCO, Banca Asiatică de Dezvoltare, Global Water Partnership, Stockholm International Water Institute și Uniunea Europeană. În paralel cu activitatea didactică și de cercetare, domnia sa a desfășurat o activitate publicistică semnificativă. A publicat în calitate de autor și coautor 3 cărți, 12 capitole în diferite cărți, 58 de articole în proiecte de specialitate, în reviste de specialitate, 36 de articole în volumele unor conferințe internaționale. Din anul 2017 și până în prezent, domnul Vairavamoorthy și-a dedicat cea mai mare parte a activității Asociației Internaționale a Apei, al cărei director executiv a fost desemnat și al cărui mandat i-a fost prelungit. În calitatea sa de director executiv al Asociației Internaționale a Apei, domnul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy are mai multe responsabilități pe care și le-a asumat și pe care le duce la îndeplinire cu succes pentru IVA. Este responsabil pentru managementul IVA și acționează ca purtător de cuvânt principal al asociației. Este responsabil pentru gestionarea membrilor asociației, care se extinde la nivel mondial și este formată din profesioniști în domeniul apei, undeva la 10.000 de membri. Este responsabil pentru luarea de decizii la nivel înalt cu privire la politicile și strategiile globale în domeniul apei, pentru dezvoltarea și implementarea politicilor operaționale și a planului strategic al IVA. Domnul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy, lucrând îndeaproape în acest sens cu Consiliul de Administrație, Consiliul Strategic și membrii guvernanți. Este responsabil pentru dezvoltarea și construirea de alianțe strategice și realizarea de parteneriate cu organizații internaționale, iar în timpul mandatului domniei sale, dezvoltarea și impactul asociației a înregistrat o creștere progresivă de la an, devenind lider în domeniul apei ca sursă de informare și voce recunoscută de autorități și alte părți interesate. Este responsabil pentru conducerea transformării digitale prin dezvoltarea unui nou sistem de management al relațiilor cu membrii IVA, sistemul Connect Plus, care include și managementul conținutului publicațiilor, conferințelor digitale și sprijinirea IVA Publishing în tranziția publicațiilor IVA către Open Access. Coordonează activitatea publicistică a IVA, care constă în momentul de față în 17 reviste științifice și peste 30 de cărți publicate anual. În plus, în fiecare an IVA organizează peste 40 de conferințe și seminarii specializate în întreaga lume. Coordonează activitatea de cercetare a membrilor IVA, urmărind calitatea cercetării și inovării pentru a menține standardul cel mai ridicat în domeniu. Sintetizează și combină munca a 50 de grupuri de specialiști din cadrul IVA, iar ca rezultat palpabil al acestei activități a rezultat un set de programe globale axate pe tehnologii de ultimă generație, a căror implementare va conduce, cel puțin pentru domeniul apei, la ceea ce numim orașele viitorului. Meritele domniei sale sunt recunoscute pe plan mondial, iar distincțiile primite în carieră demonstrează încă o dată valoarea profesională de excepție. Este deținătorul următoarelor premii: membru de onoare al Asociației Europene a Apelor în mai 2022, Water Hero în 2019, acordat de Mina Guli, fondator și CEO of Third Foundation. A fost numit în lista celor 100 de eroi pentru că este o voce consacrată în sectorul managementului apei și pentru munca intensă pentru implementarea proiectelor de apă și canalizare în întreaga lume. Premiul Water Hero 2012, acordat de Xylem, a fost inclus în lista celor 25 pentru munca sa exemplară în domeniul apei. Lista celor 25 îi evidențiază pe cei care, citez, fac o muncă importantă pentru a rezolva problemele legate de apă prin cercetare, elaborarea de politici sau soluții practice. Se regăsește pe această listă, alături de personalități cum ar fi fostul președinte al Statelor Unite Jimmy Carter, fostul secretar general al ONU Kofi Annan, prințesa moștenitoare Victoria Suediei. Calitățile profesionale recunoscute îl aduc în prim planul multor conferințe internaționale, fiind invitat în calitate de keynote speaker sau președinte, precum și la cooptare în diferite grupuri de experți internaționali implicați în lucrările de anvergură. A contribuit decisiv la organizarea impecabilă a celui mai mare congres mondial al apei în anul 2022, la Copenhaga, Danemarca, având un conținut științific de neegalat și bucurându-se de cea mai mare participare din istoria organizării acestui eveniment global, Facultatea de Hidrotehnică și Comunitatea Profesională din România fiind parte a acestui eveniment. Profesorul Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy a arătat disponibilitatea de a ajuta sectorul apei din țara noastră în vederea atingerii obiectivelor de dezvoltare durabilă, dar și în efortul de formare a tinerilor specialiști din domeniul apei. Luând în considerare cele menționate anterior, la propunerea Facultății de Hidrotehnică, Senatul Universității Tehnice de Construcții București a decis în unanimitate acordarea titlului de doctor honoris causa al Universității Tehnice de Construcții București, domnului profesor dr. Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy. Felicitări și din partea facultății noastre. Vă mulțumesc!
Thank you very much. now we reach the peak point. Could you please come here in front, and we'll help you to... Okay. Yes. And now the procedure is that the rector of the university will read the text on the diploma.
Thanks. The University Senate confers to Professor Kalanithy Vairavamoorthy, Adjunct Professor of Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, Chennai, India, the academic title of Doctor Honoris Causa of the Technical University of Civil Engineering, Bucharest, as appreciation for outstanding contributions to the development of drinking water and wastewater sector, for the activity in the service of the promotion of water engineering at international level, for the support granted to the academic community from the Technical University of Civil Engineering Bucharest, this way contributing to the increase of its visibility at international level. This is signed by the Rector and the President of the Senate, today, Bucharest, 27th of April, 2023.
And now, of course, we will have a special lecture from our Doctor Honoris Causa.
Wow, it's a very, very big day for me, so thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Technical University of Construction, Bucharest, for really bestowing a very important honor for me here today. I'd like to thank the leadership of the university, the rector, Professor Radu Vacruno, the President of the Senate, Professor Alexandra Adio. I'd also like to thank all of the distinguished guests that are here today, particularly from the Faculty of Hydrotechnics, the Dean, Professor Alexandra Dimici, and colleagues from the Department of Hydraulics, Sanitary Engineering and Environmental Protection, especially, of course, Professor Rakitinio Gabi, my friend. Last but not least, I would also like to give special thanks to Mr. Florian Berner, President of the Partnership for European Projects and Funds Association, who's a very big member of the International Water Association, for his involvement in the development of the water sector in Romania, but also for his friendship and kind support. I'd like to assure you that the International Water Association, and I have my treasurer here, Doru Popa, so I'm speaking with some confidence here, that together with all of you, we will succeed in building a strong and sustainable water sector worldwide. And that the distinction that the UTCB brings to me today obliges me to strengthen the relationships with the professional community and the water sector here in Romania. IWA has benefited a great deal from the support that we've received from the international water sector, particularly the Romanian water sector, and I see that growing. I'd like to give a short presentation, on some of the sort of topics and issues that can you all hear me okay? Some of the topics and issues that we are focusing on in IWA. As a water sector, we are at a very important juncture in our history. Water has become an important priority in many global agendas, and it's really now the time to bring water to the forefront of decision makers' minds. We know that water exists as a priority in many agendas. We're all aware of the SDGs and its dedicated goal for water and sanitation. SDG 6 deals with water and sanitation in a comprehensive manner, in that its scope includes things like wastewater management, water use efficiency, integrated water resource management, water quality management in water bodies, etc. When we think of climate change, we often say that water is the medium through which we feel the effects of climate change. I often tell my students that if climate change is a shark, then water is really the teeth of that shark. As they say, the climate crisis is really a water crisis. And it's the water sector that's really the primary victim in bearing the impacts of climate change. The IPCC recent reports clearly finds that climate change is intensifying the water cycle, and this is bringing on more intense rainfall and associated flooding, as well as more intense droughts. The wetter areas are getting wetter, and the drier areas are getting drier. So water is now very big on the climate agenda. If we look at the global risk report published by the World Economic Forum, water risk was recognized for 9 years as one of the top 5 risks to the global economy, although it's dropped down recently because of the pandemic and also because of the war in Ukraine. So clearly the private sector recognizes the importance of water. Historic droughts, more pronounced extreme weather, escalating water competition, all of these things making water a material financial risk. So as a sector, we need to be opportunistic and capitalize on these topical agendas. One of the biggest challenges we have, however, is to translate or operationalize some of these policy initiatives that we see. If we take, for example, the Paris Declaration or the Paris Agreement, and we look at the aspects of mitigation that it tries to address, it's really problematic for us as a sector to think how we might operationalize some of the statements that are being made in the Paris Agreement. I work very closely with the various banks, the IFIs, and 2 weeks ago we had the big spring meeting of the World Bank in Washington. And the World Bank sort of said to me that now all future water projects will have to have at their center the Paris Agreement. It has to be at its core. But it's very hard for us as a sector to know what is meant by that and how do we assess our contribution to reducing global emissions. There's also a lot of discussions around how we can sustain our GDP growth, but at the same time decouple the rate at which we extract resources. Okay, so we still want to grow, but we want to sort of extract less raw materials, less water, less energy, and ultimately less emissions. Again, that process of decoupling is also not very clear. And of course, there's lots of technologies that are being developed which purport to be low carbon technologies. But again, we're very unsure about how we're going to integrate some of those technologies. If we look at this, water utilities are decarbonizing their grid electricity. Okay, we're trying to get more green energy to supply the processes that we do in terms of water treatment and wastewater treatment. So the majority of our emissions will be what we call Scope 1 emissions, those which we actually generate through our processes. But the problem is we don't fully understand what these Scope 1 emissions are and how much we're generating. So the challenge particularly is difficult when we try to understand what we call fugitive emissions. Emissions like methane and nitrous oxide that we are sort of emitting through the surfaces of the various treatment processes. And it's really a big problem. You see, these fugitive emissions are actually more potent than carbon dioxide. Methane is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is about 300 times worse. Here, we see a graph on the left, which is the results of measurements of nitrous oxides from 51 different treatment systems. The x-axis that you see is really talking about different treatment technologies. AO is anoxic reactors, CAS is conventional activated sludge, and we can see for very similar treatment trains the variation in the predicted emission factors in relation to nitrous oxides. So what this tells us that, of course, nitrous oxide emissions varies for different types of treatment trains, different types of process technologies. But also where we have the same technologies, the variation is also very, very, very large. And that's because it's very much site-specific and dependent on the local environmental conditions that you're operating on. The IPCC itself has made major changes to their estimates between 2006 and 2019 in terms of what should be the emission factors that we use for the water sector. But still, a lot of people are disputing that. They feel that these numbers lack a very strong evidence base. On the right-hand side, you see similar sort of data for methane emissions. And the variation here is of 3 orders of magnitude. With this degree of variation, how can we prepare sensible audits of our emissions and in turn develop appropriate mitigation measures, which are cost-effective? And this is where we need better science, improved data collection protocols supported by the utilization of tools like machine learning is going to help us develop sensible process-specific emission data. And we are using approaches like soft sensor models in that respect. And these estimates, combined with advanced mechanistic modeling tools, will allow us to really understand emission pathways and allow us to come up with good emission strategies. One thing that you're observing within the water sector, and I'll touch upon this a bit later, is that there is a lot of innovation taking place, particularly in the area of wastewater. And a lot of that innovation is around how can we save energy in our processes. So we're really trying very hard to reduce our energy footprints. And most of these innovations change really the physics of the processes. Water is fairly heavy, and we have to move it long distances. So a lot of the innovation is about changing the physics of that. Also things like the viscosity of the liquor that we feed into our anaerobic digesters, etc. However, when we employ some of these energy-efficient systems, there are unintended consequences. For example, if we look at a process that's an energy-efficient process, when we're removing the inorganic nitrogen from ammonia-rich water, a process like Anamox, some studies have shown that even though we're using less energy in that process of dealing with our nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen, we might actually generate nitrous oxides in that process. And as I said to you, nitrous oxides are 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So on the one hand, we're reducing our carbon footprint, but we're generating these other greenhouse gas emissions that are more potent. And this might be actually quite counterintuitive, this idea that reducing energy might actually result in greater greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to be clear when we talk about mitigation goals that it's not energy that we're trying to reduce, it's greenhouse gases. And it might sound contradictory, but in some cases it might be better to use more energy in your processes so that you can reduce some of these fugitive emissions that are much more potent. The thinking of using more energy becomes compelling when we start thinking about getting more and more of our energy supplied from renewables. So then our Scope 2 emissions become very, very low. We almost are not generating any carbon emissions if we start to source all our renewables through, all our energy through renewables. In this case, it might actually be in our interest to start to deploy more energy-intensive processes because the energy we're using is renewable. And there's some really good work that's taking place in IWA at Princeton University in the United States, where they're looking at electrochemical processes, processes where you can strip the precursors for some of these greenhouse gas emissions so they never appear. The methanes and the nitrous oxides don't appear. But these electrochemical processes need electricity. But if that electricity is green, then it might be better for us in the long run. So having this sort of systems view becomes very, very important. When we think about adaptation, this is the other pillar of climate change. There's a lot of initiatives that are around in terms of trying to promote the water sector, push the water sector to become more resilient and become more adaptive. But again, the devil is in the detail. As a sector, we're very unclear about how the future is going to be. With climate change, we really are not clear at the ground level what the impacts of climate change will be on our water availability, for example. We have a lot of population variation taking place, a lot of urbanization. But the urban population is not just growing, it's growing up. People are becoming richer, their lifestyles are changing, so the rate at which they utilize resources is also increasing. So all of these factors make it very difficult for us to understand what the supply-demand deficit is going to be. In response to this uncertainty about the future, we're trying to think about resilient systems, flexible systems, adaptive systems. But again, we're not clear about what these definitions are, and we're struggling with that. Another challenge is around how we build these resilient and adaptive systems. You see, as engineers, we were traditionally taught to optimize our systems, right? To reduce any redundancy in the system so that it's cheaper. But when you start to build in things like resilience and adaptive capacity, you have to put in redundancies. And so how do you price the value of those redundancies? If I have a population of 100 people and I can supply them with so many thousands of dollars a service in water and, say, sanitation, but if I want to make it more resilient and adaptable, I can only supply 50 people, right? Because I have to build in some redundancy, then how do I reconcile these sort of difficult challenges? We have to sort of get the evidence to help us support that decision making, because really it's quite a problem at the moment. I'm sure all of you are aware of how we generate uncertainty. So if you just take climate itself, at the top, we need to know how society is going to behave. And we don't, right? We're fighting about it in all these COP meetings. How much are we going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? And we're still not very clear what the future is going to look like. Once we sort of have an understanding of how much we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by, we feed that into our global circulation models. These global circulation models all use different approaches, and they give different predictions, so we create some uncertainty there. Those global circulation models are then downscaled into regional circulation models, and there's some errors there in that downscaling process. And only then do we start to predict some of the atmospheric variables that we need for our hydrological models. And in many areas, we don't have calibrated catchment or hydrological models, right? So there's uncertainties there. And it's those hydrological models that then feed and tell us what our water resource availability is likely to be in the future. So this process creates this cascade of uncertainties that make it very difficult for us to really know what the future is going to look like. And so we have to train our young people to understand how to build things in an uncertain world. If you take this, and don't worry about these graphs, but these are some of the predictions coming from global circulation models. And the top would be like the most extreme, and the bottom would be the more favorable, right? But it creates an uncertainty envelope that we don't really know what the future is going to look like. Traditionally, what we've done is we've sort of taken a dot into the future, and we've assumed that that's what the future is going to be, and then we design in a certain trajectory. And we might design in stages, but we always design in a way that takes us to that fixed point. But now the thinking is we should build in sort of stages. And we should build in a way that we create a system that can move in 2 or 3 different directions based on how the future starts to evolve. So our systems themselves have this ability to sort of span this uncertainty envelope. And this is very difficult because we don't train our young engineers and designers in thinking about building for this sort of uncertainty and creating this ability to move in 2 or 3 different directions. If you take a good example here, which is what we call nature-based solutions for stormwater management, and it was discussed here at the conference. Things, basically we call them either sustainable urban drainage solutions or low-impact developments. These are modular systems, right? And these modular systems allow you to sort of span the uncertainty envelope in the way I just described. If you imagine that these modular solutions are in a briefcase, and you can pick and choose which solutions you choose to deploy, as your area starts to urbanize, you can cherry pick these different solutions, and you can move in 2 or 3 different directions because these are distributed or decentralized solutions that you can grow incrementally. This is very different from, say, a conventional sewer system where you lock yourself in. That diagram I showed you where you have a star and you just focus on that. You lock yourself into a certain trajectory. With these solutions, you have this adaptive capacity. And we did a lot of research on this, and we published where we found that these sustainable urban drainage systems not only outperform conventional sewer systems, not just in terms of attenuating the water, in terms of hydraulics, but also in terms of pollution, in terms of their amenity values. Against many objectives, they perform well. But also, when you apply different sort of weather patterns to them, they also seem to respond much more favorably. So this is the type of approach that we need to be encouraging, this more distributed and decentralized approaches. Now, I talked about mitigation a little bit and adaptation. These are the 2 pillars of climate policy. But now we have this third pillar that's emerged. And this really emerged after the recent COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And this is around loss and damage. And this really focuses on compensation for the impacts of climate change. Right? It's really paying those people that suffer, and it evolved from around these small island states that were going to be wiped out because of sea level rise. The challenge here is that it pits the developed countries, it sets the developed countries who are really responsible for climate, right, historically, against the developing countries who have not really contributed too much to the climate problem, but who suffer from it and who have the least ability to cope with some of the impacts of that. It's been a long discussion, but it was only in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh that decisions were made to set up an international fund to support those countries that are disproportionately affected by climate change. But again, the devil is in the detail, right? Let's say that I'm in a country and we have severe flooding and there's a lot of damage, right? Is that damage because of what's happened to climate? Or is it because our own decision makers were irresponsible and they built the infrastructure in the wrong way? They just urbanized and put impervious areas everywhere. And that's what really caused the severe problems we face, as opposed to the climate itself. These sorts of discussions become very challenging. If, for example, I experience a drought because of climate, and I think I want to go to this fund and get some compensation. But then when you look into it, you find that the decision makers in that particular city were very irresponsible. They didn't manage their water losses. They didn't employ demand conservation measures. And so the scarcity issues are not just only due to climate change, but also because of irrational management. So these are really difficult things that, I wrote about recently in an article, that people really don't know how to operationalize these concepts. And then when we think about it from an ethical point of view, you have some big economies like India and China who will seek funding from the loss and damage, and rightly so, but they are also now emitting large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So is it right to compensate countries who are still emitting large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions? So although the world has come and put together these ideas, nobody really thinks about how you might operationalize these ideas. So the status quo is not an option for our sector, and I lead an association where we're really trying to think about how the future will look and what we need to do, and I'll try and share with you some thoughts. But I start to say that, that we're confronted with two converging forces, at least two. One is that we're trying to transition to a new type of way we manage water, and it's really around a circular economy approach. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of think about how we use water more wisely, can we do more with less? And we're also thinking about how can we extract value from our waste streams. At the same time that we're trying to do this, we realize that we're dealing with an uncertain world and that we have to start building in redundancies to make our systems respond and weather certain shocks. So we're trying to design our systems that can cope with extreme weather, but also that they can adapt in the way that I described to the future. This situation really is putting us in a place where we really need a new type of leadership, right? And a new type of innovation, which is unprecedented in our history. And for those of you who are academics, you know how we educate our people, because we need people now who are much more creative and imaginative. And they start using more of their right brain as opposed to their left brain. So we have to now encourage our young people to use a different part of the brain from where we traditionally think about decision making, because we are sort of in this very difficult situation. So when we think about how the water sector is moving forward in terms of change, I see two big changes. One is around the productive use of water. This was a term that was often used in agriculture, but we're seeing this now emerging in the urban water sector. And the productive use of water is asking ourselves, what is it we want the water to do for us? And how can we match the quantity and the quality of water for that intended use? And we're moving away from this idea that we should use drinking water for everything. Can we create a certain grade of water for drinking? can we create a different grade of water for industry? And can we create a different grade of water, say, for our landscape gardening, for flushing our toilets? And so we're starting to see this idea of using and creating different grades of water for different uses. And in that respect, we start to think about using water multiple times. There are some good examples. This is a classic example from California. This is the West Basin Initiative, where they take wastewater from the city of Los Angeles, and they create what they call designer waters, waters of different flavors. And each of these waters are really for a different purpose. So for irrigation, they might maintain some of the nutrients that are embedded in the water, because nutrients are good for irrigation. They might remove those nutrients when they use that water, for example, for artificial recharge. And then they might use certain inferior quality waters for things like cooling and for other industrial processes. But this technology, because they're using a lot of membrane technology, they can plug and play, and they can change the slates in terms of the different treatment trains that they're offering. We also see other sort of areas where we're using waters of different grade. I mean, one interesting area where there's some research taking place is really around indirect forward osmosis. And this is where we use wastewater to dilute seawater, right? So it's a forward osmosis process. So we're moving the water away from the waste so we can then collect the waste streams. We're diluting the seawater, and therefore the cost for desalination goes down because we have much lower concentrations. And there are things like sewer mining, where we extract directly from the sewer for things like irrigating golf courses and large parks, where we treat the water to an extent, but we maintain the nutrient quality. So a lot of this is happening. Critical to this, in my view, is that we view the entire water cycle as one. And we view, so the drinking water supply, the stormwater side, and your wastewater side. And you view all water within your system as good water. It's just water of a different quality, right? So now let's say that I have a growing population. I have the choice of either importing more water from afar, so importing some surface water and bringing it to the city, or I could invest in leakage management and demand management, because that frees up high-quality drinking water. If I wanted to water my plants or flush my toilets, I could import more surface water or groundwater and bring it from afar, or I could use my grey water and black water with or without treatment for those purposes. So viewing the system through this lens allows us to look for efficiency gains from within our system. Critical to this is really modeling. And there's a lot of work on what we call integrated urban water modeling, where we try to model the flows that take place in the system, and we sort of connect the dots, these different grades of water for different uses. And what we're seeing is modeling where we're modeling packets of water as they move through the system. And each packet of water has associated with it an energy footprint, a chemical footprint, and we also know where that water was sourced from. And so by understanding that, we can match these different grades of water for different uses. And we can sort of really meet our growing demands from within the system rather than importing water. This is some work I did some time ago with the World Bank, where we were working in Nairobi, and the sort of natural solution by the government of the utility in Nairobi to meet their growing demand was to just import more water. So what you see in blue is new surface water sources. But when we applied the integrated modeling, we looked and realized that there was a lot of water embedded in the system that could be freed up to meet that growing demand without bringing new water to the city. And the unit cost of that would be actually cheaper. Once we started to look at more exotic sources of water, so this is like treating black water and maybe having rainwater harvesting at the household level, which is not as cost effective as, say, having it at a cluster level, the water costs become more expensive. But this integrated approach allows us to explore these different options to meet the growing water demand and avoids us having just to bring new water to the city. And we've published that in a book which you can download. This approach of viewing the entire urban water cycle through a single lens has moved a lot of cities to start to diversify their water sources. They're starting to create a portfolio of options, like you do with the stocks. You know, people buy a portfolio of stocks, right, to balance losses against some of the gains. And what they're doing is they're trying to mitigate the risks of becoming water scarce by having these alternative sources. This is Chennai in South India, very water scarce region. They depend a lot on surface water, but now they have huge water reuse programs for industry, which means that they don't have to supply industry through the drinking water system. They've embarked on large rainwater harvesting programs at the cluster level. And they've got desal, which they might apply when they are suffering from extreme droughts. But there are other interesting things. They're looking at stormwater capture. They're looking at disused quarries and mines, which have natural depressions, which could be a place where stormwater could be captured. Of course, these are industrial sites, so that water has to be treated, and they're using natural systems for that. But they feel that by having this portfolio of solutions, they can sort of mitigate and they can sort of prevent any risks of water scarcity in the future. The classic example of this that most people will quote is Singapore. Okay, Singapore has what they call their 4 national taps. And, you know, they always worry about the silver one at the bottom there, which is the water from Malaysia, Johor Bahru. And there was always this risk that Malaysia would switch that tap off and Singapore would be dry. They don't have any water on the land. So what did they do? They invested in the Marina Barrage, the blue tap at the end, which is really a stormwater capture system, also acts as a flood defense. They invested in desal to sort of augment their water supplies. And then they created this thing called New Water, which is the reused water. And they actually wanted to use that water for drinking. A lot of people weren't keen to drink that new water, but they now use it for industrial processes. So again, they're able to sort of minimize the risks by having a portfolio of options available to them. And you're seeing this happening a lot in many countries. Now, some of these technologies to sort of recycle and do all this stuff is expensive. They're energy, they use a lot of energy. But there are opportunities to use nature-based solutions also to close the loop. And there's a lot of interest around nature-based solutions. Always the best strategy is to protect your source waters, right? Because then you don't have to treat the water so much. So you can apply vegetation, or what we call ecohydrology principles, where you use vegetation to sort of filter the water as it runs off, so that your water source doesn't get polluted. Now, once you extract from the river, you can use things like river and lake bank filtration, where you use the capacity of the soil to treat the water before it goes into supply. Once you use that water once, you can reuse it for irrigation, or you can use things like constructed wetlands, waste stabilization ponds, very natural systems to treat that waste, and then polish it with something like, say, soil aquifer treatment, again using the soil to polish that before putting it back into supply. Now, these nature-based solutions require more land, but their energy footprints are much lower. And these systems are becoming popular, mainly in response to issues of mitigation, because they use less energy, but also they have an adaptive capacity. The public love these types of systems because people like to have vegetation around them rather than concrete structures. However, engineers, they're very nervous about these systems because they feel that these systems are unpredictable. They feel that they're not sure how they, respond to seasonal variability. They don't know how to design them. I mean, very often, we use general sort of experiences of what worked in the past to design them. We might use rules of thumb. So we need more science to underpin our understanding of nature-based solutions, particularly in terms of their effectiveness, their efficiency, and their environmental and financial sustainability. Because only then will we be able to ensure that they have long-term success and they're scalable. So we do need researchers, and in IWA we will be setting up a new specialist group that looks at this, where we dig deeper into sort of understanding what these processes are, the flows and the fluxes that take place. What are the potential fugitive emissions that these systems might give out? And how can they respond to various hydrological processes? So this is an area that we're doing quite a lot of work in. The next area that is really big in what we're doing is around waste as a resource. This is the second change in perspective that you see taking place within the water sector. And, there are many areas where we generate waste. It's not just wastewater. A lot of innovation around fecal sludge, where we have non-sewered sanitation, the waste that come from septic tanks. We have solid waste. We have agro-industrial waste. And all of these sort of generally produce 3 categories of use, right? Water reuse, nutrient recovery, and energy. There is also innovation around things like bioplastics and things, but these are the classic ways that we approach it. EME, where I used to work, and I was Deputy Director General, we did a lot of work on this, and we published a lot around different types of approaches to recovering value from the waste streams, and I would encourage you to download these because they're all freely available. But again, this resource recovery narrative, right, it's good to look at the whole water cycle as one. There are many areas within the water cycle where you can capture energy. The classic one, of course, is at the wastewater treatment works, where we take where we do anaerobic digestion and we generate biogas, or we use something like microbial fuel cells. But there's research taking place in South Africa, and they've implemented some microturbines in the water distribution system where they have high pressure heads, and they capture energy and they use that to support their telemetry systems. Of course, there's a lot of work in Northern Europe around using heat exchangers to gain heat from sewers and use that heat to sort of support both air conditioning and also heating. Also with nutrients, right, the classic place is at the sewage treatment works where, you can precipitate some of the phosphorus out, but you can also extract nutrients from your fecal sludge. So there are different places within the water cycle where you can extract value. This is just one example from Jordan, Asma in Jordan, where it's a very large plant. They treat 70% of the wastewater for Jordan. But because of elevation, the city's at the top, the wastewater treatment works is very low. They have this big hydraulic, this sort of deviation. And so they put in turbines, hydropower turbines, to generate energy as the wastewater flows to the treatment works. They then use anaerobic digestion to generate biogas at the wastewater treatment works itself. And then a very, very large proportion of the water that they treat is used for irrigation. And they quote that this water being used for irrigation frees around water for 2 million inhabitants. So they can provide 2 million people with the water that they save because of the water that's being used for agriculture. Now, one of the problems we see in this area is that it's very much in its early stage. This whole area of resource recovery and reuse, it's still very much at the R&D level. We don't have many good business models that seem to work, right? But it will become the norm in the future, but we're still experimenting. Now, again, at EME, we did a lot of work where we analyzed 150 case studies where people had deployed these technologies. And what we found was that most of them worked when there was risk capital, when a donor helped and funded them. But once the donor left, these systems didn't work. They didn't generate enough revenue for it to be sustainable. And again, I would recommend, there's a very thick book that EME did where they analyzed all of these different business models and sort of found the ones that worked and the ones that didn't. Let me give you an example, right? Just to show you the complexity. It's not the way people think and the way people say. So one approach was around struvite production, extracting phosphorus from your waste streams and producing struvite. And everybody in conferences used to say, you can be a millionaire if you can sell this struvite. It's a high-quality fertilizer. You can make a lot of money. But the business model is more complicated, right? So if you look at it, you have a house that sends its wastewater to a wastewater treatment provider. They pay money to the wastewater treatment provider. The wastewater treatment provider might subcontract a company to extract the phosphorus from their waste streams, right? And the reason they do that is because you get precipitation of phosphorus products in the return to activated sludge lines. And that sort of gives you a burden in terms of your operational maintenance. They block the pipes. So why they actually bringing these phosphorus recovery people is to reduce their operational maintenance costs. And that's where a lot of these phosphorus recovery companies make their money. It's from that part of the business. Now, of course, they can then generate struvite and they can sell it for fertilizer use, and they make a little bit of money, but the bulk of the money is really in terms of their operational maintenance. And if they've taken that technology from someone else, they might have to pay for the patent, right, of that technology. So this business model is actually quite complicated. And most of the engineers who come up with these ideas don't fully understand the business proposition at play, right? They just think that because in the lab I could generate X quantity of nutrients, if I multiply that by the population of Romania, I can be a millionaire. But taking an idea from a research laboratory and commercializing it are two different things. So I just wanted you to think about that. Now, this whole area of resource recovery and productive use has changed the language in the water sector. We no longer are talking about water treatment and wastewater treatment. We're starting to talk about water machines, right? And these machines are where we have water of different grades entering this machine, we turn the handle, and we can create waters of different grades, this idea of productive use. We turn the handle, and we can create energy in the form of electricity or heat. And we turn the handle and we can generate things like nutrients and byproducts, right? So where we locate these treatment technologies and the types of technology we use is much more related to some of the resources that we can recover. So if we wanted to generate energy, we know that the energy from the sewage sludge might not be enough to generate energy to run the plant. So we might want to co-digest that with agro-industrial waste. So we might locate the plant in a way where we can source this agro-industrial waste much more easily. And so it's really changed the language of our sector. And you have some good examples. This is a colleague of us from IWA, Professor Peter Cornell from TU Darmstadt, where they actually built this sort of type of water machine in Qingdao in China, and it's a very effective way of doing it. But what they found was that it was better to build these systems for much smaller populations. Rather than having highly centralized systems, if you service populations of around 20 to 30,000, 30 to 50,000 people, these systems work well. And this is the next point, right, that we're seeing the sector moving much more into sort of distributed systems. They're going away from these highly centralized systems and creating what we call decentralized systems. And these decentralized systems have what we call this adaptive capacity. So if you have an area that's urbanizing, rather than building a large centralized infrastructure, as the area urbanizes over time, you can start adding modules and you can grow your system progressively, just like we saw with the rainwater, with the urban drainage solutions. And you're seeing a lot of interest in this. I'm actually going to a think tank in 2 weeks' time at ETH in Switzerland, where we're trying to see how can we take this to the water sector and get them to sort of experiment with this. These systems also have quite a lot of resilience. You see, with a centralized system, if there's an extreme event, the whole system gets knocked out. Whereas these systems, it's very localized. It doesn't affect everybody. It will affect the particular module if there's a flood or something, but other systems can still function. So it also has a certain degree of resiliency that we don't have with our conventional systems. And of course, water is heavy. You don't want to move water a long distance to supply it to people. Long distance, move it away, treat it, and then bring it back again long distances. A lot of energy. With these decentralized systems, you're sourcing the water closer to its use, and you're reusing and using it multiple times closer to the use. And we're seeing a lot of interest in this area. And it's not only in new cities that we're seeing this, even in existing cities where, in a city in India, we'd have a centralized urban infrastructure, that pink color, which was maybe built by the colonialists. And as the area starts to urbanize, we extend our centralized infrastructure to meet that growing demand. And we end up with a very large spaghetti sort of network of infrastructure that doesn't work particularly well. What people are arguing now is that you ring fence that central core, that's the historical core of your city. But then in the outskirts, you start looking at developing these decentralized options. Right? And so you have, if you like, a hybrid. You have a centralized coexisting with lots of decentralized options. And with these decentralized options, they can change the technology makeup as technology evolves. This was a project we did in Uganda, where you can see, this is a city in Uganda, Arusha. You can see the centralized core there, and the infrastructure is spreading. And so what we did, we said, what if we ring-fence that central infrastructure and we created decentralized clusters around it? And we looked at sort of sourcing the water locally. We looked at decentralized wastewater treatment where the water could be reused. And we found that this could work. It was an academic exercise, and so it wasn't implemented. But we found that the cost of doing a decentralized approach was actually cheaper than going for the centralized approach. Now, even though it was an academic exercise, it got the decision makers thinking about these types of possibilities. Their creative right brain started to work about what the options could be. And it's again published. And you're seeing examples of estates, the Battery Park Estate in New York, very famous. They're coming off the grid. I think they're only using about 20% of the water that they were from the grid, and the rest they're sort of doing clever things on their own sites. And there are lots of examples like that. The other area that I think is important, right, because I've talked about the transition that we're trying to make, is the whole area of how ready is the sector to take on some of those transitions. We've talked about the potential, reducing our emissions, using water more productively, getting waste, the resourcefulness, getting value from our waste. But then we have to think, how ready are we? Is the technology ready, right? Is the organizations ready, etc.? And this is really a big area. Now, technology readiness level, you will, I'm sure, all know that the European Union has worked a lot on that, and over the last 10 years, we've created this sort of ladder of technology readiness, and we have these 9 stages. Number 1 would be the guy in the lab just thinking about the problem and sort of playing. And then as you move up these technology readiness levels, it sort of becomes a sort of a pilot scale, and then it becomes a demonstration project. And then you sort of, around 7 and 8, you start to commercialize this product, and then it starts to be used in industry. And so with a lot of technology, we ask, where does it sit on this technology ladder? But it's not just about technology, right? We have to have these other readinesses, which is just now evolving as a new sort of thought piece. We have societal readiness. And this asks, are we addressing a real problem that society needs? Have there been enough sort of stakeholder engagement in testing these ideas? And is society willing to adopt some of these new ideas? And are they willing to pay for it? Then we go in terms of the organization itself, the utility. You know, are they ready? Do they have the capacity, their infrastructure, the capability and skills of their staff? And can they integrate these new ideas into their processes? And what would be the pain to gain ratio? You know, how much pain would they have to experience in order to make the transition? And then I think the most important one is the legal side, the regulatory landscape, right? You know, a utility might want to change, but the regulations might not allow them to change. And then the question is really, you know, could the regulator be the inhibitor, the person stopping them from doing these clever things? Or could the regulator actually be the person who encourages the transition? You know, through regulation, they actually push utilities to innovate and think out the box. And within IWA, we have our regulators forum, where we're really trying to get them to be those sort of champions of change. Now, it's not homogeneous, right? It's a very complex issue. So if you look at something like waste to energy, right? The readiness here is very high in terms of technology readiness, but it's also very high in terms of the other dimensions, right? People don't really have a problem with using biogas. You know, organizations have the capacity to do it. The regulators aren't too worried. So this has sort of high levels of readiness across all the dimensions. So the uptake is fairly good. But if you look at sort of material pathways, things like, say, direct water use, and you have Bill Gates drinking reused water there, it may be technologically viable, right? But society is not really prepared to sort of drink reused water. So on these other dimensions, and the regulations are very, very tight, they inhibit this sort of approach, right? So then on these dimensions, it's very low. And so in order for us to push portable reuse, we shouldn't be focusing on developing more and more technologies, but we should be thinking about these other dimensions to get it through. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I finish is around digital water. Within IWA, we have a big digital water program. And, you know, the way I would like to contextualize it is the water sector, with everything I said, has to become smarter, right? We have to become smart in the way we design things, and this is, you know, distributed, decentralized systems with this adaptive capacity. We have to be smart about the way in which we use our resources, and this is using water multiple times and extracting value from our waste streams. But there's also this other element, how we control the system so that we can do these clever things, right? Digital is just an enabler. It's not the end. It's just a way for us to transition to this new normal. And when we think about it, I mean, this is just a quote. It's a bit old, but it sort of talks about the potential savings of monitoring and automation. But what I wanted to focus on is really the ecosystem that we see in terms of digital. We have several elements. We have, you know, the work around sensors, and there's a lot of innovation in the space of sensors. And IWA, their most successful program currently is the digital water program. But sensors, you know, are becoming more sophisticated in terms of the velocity and variety. We're able to monitor more things, and the rate at which we can capture things is faster. So we're generating much larger volumes of data. And they're getting smaller and they're cheaper. Right? And you're seeing things like multi-parameter arrays that can measure many parameters across a contamination spectrum. So you get a sort of more holistic view about what's happening to your water. In say, for example, water losses, we have what we call these pipe robotics, right? Which are sort of sensors that, you know, monitor pressure, and they use technologies like ultrasonic, magnetic, and even have small cameras on board. And if you look at, say, for example, the pipe probe, you know, you drop it into the pipe network, it runs through, and it gives you a good assessment of the condition of your drinking water pipes and where leaks might be and what sort of interventions you might have to employ. Now, once you've got the sensors, you start processing that data, and this is where we see a lot of technology, right? We're moving away from what we call mechanistic models, models that were based on the physics of processes. We're moving much more to sort of data-driven models, this sort of machine learning type approach. And we're starting to see the growth of predictive analytics, where we're forecasting what might happen in the future. And we're able to anticipate issues before they happen. You have sort of technologies, which use artificial neural networks that look at variations of flow and pressure and are able to predict in advance that there may be a leak, there may be a pipe that's about to break. And we're seeing the development of cognitive computing, where we're actually able to simulate the way humans might think. And really, with the advent of things like OpenAI, we're seeing things like the ability to process structured and unstructured data together. Structured data is the usual stuff, right? Pipe diameter, pipe length, pipe age, pressure, velocity. Your unstructured data are things like, people's chats, videos, images, these types of things. And so you're seeing technology where we're starting to process more and more unstructured data. And in terms of these new iterations of OpenAI and what they call large language models, LLMs, you're seeing this ability to sort of process both text and images. And this advanced ability to work with natural language and images make them very flexible and adaptive. And, IWA is now looking at what the implications of some of this technology will be, particularly for smaller utilities that don't have the capacity to understand the technologies that they're using very often. And the last part of this ecosystem is really smart pumps and valves, right? And this is where we have automated control. You have pumps and valves that have onboard computers with actuators, and they're all sort of like little brains in themselves. They can self-regulate, they can change pressures and flows, the speed of the pumps can change, and they can even go into sort of diagnostic modes where they can sort of understand when they have to go off and be repaired, etc. And so what you have is you have these things working together and creating what we call a digital ecosystem that's moving us into what we call silent running systems, where actually maybe the human involvement will be limited, right? These things sort of talk to each other and they self-regulate. And this is what we're seeing emerging in terms of thinking within the water sector. To give you some examples, if you take, for example, asset management, understanding what happens to our pipes under the ground. It was a dark art, and I did a lot of research in this area where we're almost guessing what's happening to our pipes by looking at age, material, and the type of, the way they were laid, etc. And we try to guess because we can't dig up the pipes and check if we were right or wrong. But now you're seeing the sort of combining the structured data with unstructured data, things like, customer complaints, CCTV images, the quality of the contractors. You're combining that with sort of external data around weather, around transport, around soil conditions in which the pipes were laid. That's sort of being fed into large analytical models that start to predict the pipe condition. And when they predict the pipe condition, you combine that with a hydraulic model, and that hydraulic model tells you which pipes are significant, which pipes are really responsible for carrying most of the water in your system. You couple that with the pipes which are in the worst condition, and then you do what's called a criticality analysis, and that feeds your optimal pipe rehabilitation approach. So it tells you what sequence should we replace the pipes in. And if you were right, and that the model predicted well, then you would feed that back to the analytical engine that sort of, recalibrates itself and improves its performance. So you have this feedback loop. Another area, if you go back, if you have a pipe burst that takes place, and then you have, sensors everywhere, right, throughout this. Let me go back because it's an animation. So you have sensors, and these sensors then feed an inverse modeling approach, right? An inverse hydraulic model, which then tells you where that leak might have taken place. And then it feeds an optimal valve isolation model, which then instigates certain valves to isolate. So it stops the leaks taking place. That information is then sort of fed into your integrated asset management system, your customer information system, and your work system. And then you can tell the repairers specifically what type of material to take, what equipment to take to repair that leak. You can also inform the customer well in advance that they're going to have a time without water. So this is the type of approach we're seeing because sensors are all over the place and they can pick these things up very quickly. Again, you're seeing this idea of using open ChatGPT, which I know is very fashionable, but they're doing what we call sentiment analysis. So when people complain, when they write to the company, you can almost sort of understand the sentiment, right, in which they wrote. Were they happy? Were they unhappy? Were they very upset? And then you can start checking with other complaints and correlating and seeing, yes, there's really an issue ahead, and we have to deal with it. And so again, as I said, for utilities that don't have capacity, and I tell you, there's people who've done experiments where they've gone to ChatGPT and say, can you tell me what I need to do to build a hydraulic model? And it tells them exactly what data they need, where to collect it, how to collect it, so they can then build the hydraulic model. It's got to that level of sophistication, so it's moving very fast. My last slide, and I always finish with this slide, as many of you know, is that, you know, we're at a sort of a juncture, as I said at the beginning of my presentation. We can't stay in the left lane, right? Business as usual. Global change means that we can't continue business as usual, right? You know, most of our infrastructure was built in the 19th century, when, and the thinking came from the 19th century, where we thought, you know, water was abundant, we thought populations would remain relatively small, and we thought the environment was benign and we could throw anything. And so we created these take, make, and waste systems, right? Create one quality, take the water, create one quality, use it once, throw it away. Okay, we can't do that anymore because of global change pressures that are going to affect how supply-demand deficit. The other option is to go into the middle lane, which is currently where most of the water sector is. They're tinkering, right? They're trying to repurpose their existing infrastructure to see if they can respond to this change. But there's not enough capacity to tinker. And so really we have to move to the right lane, where we have to have a sort of a paradigm shift, where we start thinking more around circular solutions, where we start thinking about more adaptive solutions, and we look at wastes as value, right? And we try to extract some value so we can sustain financially our systems moving forward. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I might say brilliant and challenging, impressive overview of where we are and what is ahead of us, especially with so many uncertainties. Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation. And this somehow ends our ceremony. We will listen again to the music that you already heard before, and after that maybe you would like to enjoy photo session again with friends in the audience and so on. Once again, thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
TCB. Viitorul e al tău, noi punem temelia.